Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Pam Cometer, and today, along with Jess Silver, I am thrilled to co-chair today's virtual workshop presented by the Mandel Center for Leadership Development. I'm glad to see so many ELP and MLI alumni today. Events such as this one in our community would not be possible without the support of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation. The Mandel Center works to engage and develop high-performance volunteers and professional leaders throughout the greater Palm Beach Jewish community. During challenging times like these, Jewish leaders must support and nourish the organizations they serve. As individuals who have both had to lead and respond in an unprecedented manner, oftentimes that can mean having to navigate difficult conversations to move forward with change for yourself and for your organization. Today's workshop will provide concrete resources and concepts to use now and in the future. You'll hear from Deborah, as well as be placed in breakout rooms with others for robust conversations. Now, I'd like to introduce to you our fabulous speaker, Deborah Grayson Rigel. Deborah is a communication and behavior expert who helps corporations, Jewish organizations, and individuals achieve personal, interpersonal, and professional success. Her clients range from American Express to the JCC Association to Toyota and the United States Army, just to name a few. Deborah has been a contributor and featured expert in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and Forbes. Deborah earned her bachelor's in psychology at the University of Michigan and her master's in social work at Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Grayson Rigel.
Thanks so much, Pam, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today as we talk about navigating conflict and difficult conversations. And if some of you are like me, your high school or college age kids had the world's longest spring break starting in March 2020, right? I don't know how many of you can relate, but I certainly, my husband, Michael, and I were crushing it as empty nesters. We had sent 2 kids off to college. It was the best thing we had ever done, was to get the kids out of the house. And then, of course, everybody came back home. And all of a sudden, our relatively conflict-free, difficult conversation life was an everyday battle with 2 kids who didn't want to be home and 2 adults who didn't want them home either. And so everything that we're going to be talking about today are certainly things that I use with my coaching clients, use with my corporate clients, with workshops, leaders, and teams. But I also want you to know that every strategy we're going to be talking about today is something where I've experimented on a human person living in my house. And if they have survived it, I believe it is safe to bring it to you. So let me start with one of my absolute favorite sayings about today's topic, which comes from Franklin P. Jones on the Saturday Evening Post, who said, "Honest criticism is hard to take, particularly from a relative, a friend, an acquaintance, or a stranger." So what is it that Franklin P. Jones is telling us? It says, when we feel criticized, it almost doesn't matter the source. It is hard for us to engage in things that feel like conflict. And today we are going to be talking about some strategies that you can use to help you navigate, prevent, manage difficult conversations, regardless of whether it's coming from a relative, a friend, an acquaintance, or a stranger. So our overview for today, before we dig into our conversation, is what contributes to unproductive conflict, understanding the root cause of common conflicts, recognizing your personal conflict habit, and that is the part where we will be asking you to share some of the results of the assessment that you did online before this webinar, hopefully, how to avoid avoiding conflict, and how to snap out of an unproductive conversation that is going down the wrong path. So the first question that I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pop an answer in the chat box. And I'm going to ask you not to overthink it. I just want to hear or read your gut response to this question. How do you feel when you hear the word conflict? Unsettled, yes. Anxious, uneasy. ready to tackle, annoyed, stressed, irritated, I tighten up, I get uncomfortable, sad, it's complicated, I get upset, absolutely. So I actually, I've got a physiological response. When I hear the word conflict or anticipate conflict, all of a sudden I can feel like my salivary glands start to tighten. I mean, if that's not like a, an original biological response, I feel a tightening in here and a ball in my throat. And then eventually it feels like if you've ever been in an elevator that dropped a little bit, where your stomach comes up and the rest of you go down, that's how I feel in the face of conflict. And so one of the things that's really important for us to understand is that when we experience conflict, we are likely having an automatic response. And it's important for us to say that, because when we're having an automatic response, it means that we are not going to be thinking at our best. We're not going to be thinking at our strongest. And so a lot of the resources that I want to share with you today are things that you are going to have to practice in good times so that they're actually a part of your system when conflict happens, because we don't have access to our higher level thinking when we feel that conflict response. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about conflict. So most of us have shared that when we hear the word conflict, we feel uncomfortable, we tighten up, we're ready for battle. And part of that is because I believe we may not be looking at conflict the right way. So I want to share with you one interpretation of conflict that was particularly helpful for me. That conflict is a disagreement or a difference of opinion or perspective. So take a moment to let that explanation settle in for a second. A disagreement or a difference of opinion or perspective. And based on that definition of conflict, how often are you having conflict most days? And go ahead and take yourself off mute or pop that in the chat box. How often are you having disagreements or difference of opinions or perspectives? All day. Right? I'm right there with you. I'm seeing this from everyone, that it's happening all day, every 15 minutes, and a range of things. I also see here from Ethan, not often, maybe twice a quarter. My kids are 4 and 5 every day, right? So one of the things that has been helpful for me is to realize that conflict, one way of looking at conflict is a disagreement or a difference of opinion or perspective, which really normalizes it. And it reminds me that if this is an understanding of what conflict is, we see it differently, we hold different beliefs, we've got different perspectives around this. I am regularly crushing it at conflict, right? If this is happening to me all day, right? Everything from my daughter says, let's have dinner for breakfast. And I was like, let's have breakfast for breakfast. Everything from that, from my clients saying, I like your proposal, but I think it's too expensive. And I go, actually, I think it's quite reasonable. It's happening every day and I'm doing fine. One of the things that we want to keep in mind is that what we are really looking for is productive conflict. So let's look at what we are going towards. What we want to go towards is conflict that achieves an outcome and attends to the relationship before, during, and after. And the case that I want to make to you is that if you are not having productive conflict where you're getting stuff done and the relationship is doing well, you actually have no diversity. Right? And if you have no diversity, you also don't have a lot of inclusion. And I work with clients ranging from Google and Amazon to American Express and BlackRock, and every single one of them have something around diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of their goals and core values. And if you're not having any conflict, it means that you have hired people who replicate you, and that is not what these organizations are looking for. So productive conflict is something we want so that we have a diversity of perspectives and opinions, but it's got these two elements, that it actually gets something done and that the people ultimately feel listened to, heard, and taken care of. And this can feel really different from the kind of conflict that makes us frustrated, upset, or nauseous, right? So unproductive conflict is conflict where we either don't achieve an outcome, right? People feel great about the process, but we actually never got anywhere, or we got somewhere, but I often feel like we are leaving bodies along the way, right? There are victims along the way of us getting somewhere. And then, of course, sometimes we're in conflict where we didn't get anywhere and everyone just feels like crap. And that is certainly not what we're going for as well. So the tools that we're going to be talking about today is how do you achieve an outcome in a way that also attends to the relationship as well. So just by way of this conversation, one thing that I'd really like to hear from you, again, over the chat box, if you want to take yourself off mute, is who is somebody who you know who manages productive conflict well, and what is something you've observed them do? So this is somebody who helps achieve an outcome and the people about it feel taken care of. Who would that be for you, and what do they do? Anyone want to share?
Sure, I will.
Great.
Yeah, my husband also, I'm seeing a lot of my husbands, and he considers at least two things right from the get-go. One is what's our goal? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? And the other is he can really put himself in the other person's shoes, and he fashions his questions or his comments very much from their headset and their perspective.
Yeah. Excellent. I love that. And I love the idea of asking ourselves, right? If it's our husband or a sibling or somebody we work with, what would they do in this situation, right? So I often find myself in the face of conflict, I get very direct. And I often think about my husband, who is much less direct, and think about what from his approach could be more helpful. I'm also seeing some other comments in here. My person validates the other person. They literally say valid and then proceed with their point of view. I love that, Pam. And it reminds me something of, my kids are twins and they always argued nonstop. And so some language that I taught them early on was to say to the other person, you might be right, or you've given me something to think about, or, I hadn't looked at it that way. None of those things are saying you are right and I am wrong, but it at least builds a little bit of a bridge of you've got something there worth considering. Great. So I will just share with you that many years ago, I did a version of this workshop for the New York City Department of Transportation, right? They are the pothole people. And when I asked them to think of a role model they knew of somebody who handled conflict well, nobody in the room had an example. And I was like, well, I think that actually explains a lot, that none of them could picture anybody they'd ever met who handled conflict well. So we're going to dig in a little bit more to this topic. I want to share with you from the book Connect. And this is a book that was written by the folks who run the interpersonal training at Stanford Business School. And here's what they share with us. And they share with us that in almost every case, in the face of conflict, we have choices. How the other person responds to those choices makes some choices harder and some choices easier. Both statements are equally valid. I have a choice, right? And I am affected by you. And so the question that I have for you is, what responses to a difficult conversation make choices harder? And then we're going to ask, what responses to a conversation make your choices easier? And I'm just going to take this down for a second so that we can have a conversation. What choices in the face of a difficult conversation make things harder or easier for you?
So it would be like attacking voices. So no, or you're wrong, or that's not right, or something that diminishes whatever that individual was saying.
Good. So sort of cut and dry, yes or no answers, and telling people that they're wrong definitely can get in the way. Yeah. What else can make your choices harder or easier?
I don't know if we're supposed to raise hands.
You just go ahead. If I got you, I'm going to take advantage of having you.
I think when you're in a situation where someone comes out of the gate saying, there's nothing you can say to change my mind.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Right. Where they've already told you there's no winning here.
Right.
Yeah. What are some other things?
When you see like obvious defiance from the other person, that there's just no compromise to be had.
Yes, great. Right. And I can tell you for me, my choices all of a sudden become much narrower when somebody yells. When somebody raises their voice, I just shut down, and all of a sudden I feel like I have no choices available to me. And that's a really hard situation to be in. And what choices make it easier to be in the face of conflict?
Having access to complete information, right? So you know everything about the situation that's going on and you can speak accordingly to it. Yep,
absolutely. I'm also seeing in the chat box here, somebody lying. I'm assuming that's the answer to the first one, which is what makes things harder. Other things that make it easier. Go ahead.
Having the time to actually set aside to try to resolve, so to have that conversation.
Yes.
Without interrupting you.
Absolutely. And so one of the things, as you're describing all this, one of the things that's really helpful for us to keep in mind is one of the places where conflict originates. And this comes from a book with one of my favorite titles called Make Difficult People Disappear. And I love that title. And then unfortunately, I noticed down here, it says A Workplace Fable, which is such a bummer because I have a list of people that I'd love to make disappear. And I would imagine that if you're on today's call, you do as well. But here's the perspective that I really appreciate from this book. The authors write, conflict occurs when we demand and expect others to behave in a way that is not natural or known to them, right? We have a picture in our head of how somebody should show up in a difficult situation, in a tricky conversation, in the face of conflict. And when we expect somebody's behavior to match that picture, we find ourselves in conflict. We find ourselves in trouble. And so I want to share some unhelpful perspectives when it comes to conflict. And then for anybody who's willing to say, yep, I recognize that perspective in myself, welcome to the party. Would love to hear what you recognize in yourself here. So here are some perspectives when it comes to conflict that are not particularly helpful. How could they not know the right way to behave? They should act the way I expect them to act. It's not helpful to think they should act the way I act, which means that you have a very elevated picture of how you act in the face of conflict. It is not helpful to think I am right, they are wrong. It is not helpful to think my view is the only valid view. It's not helpful to think nobody likes them anyway. It is not helpful to think their intention is obvious. And one of the reasons why that's so unhelpful is that impact is visible, intentions are not. We think we know somebody's intentions based on how much trust we have in our relationship with them, but we actually don't know them. They are invisible. It is not helpful to think, oh, it's just their personality. Once we ascribe something to somebody's personality, we sort of give up any chance of hoping to change a behavior. And it is not helpful to think, I'll see how they like it when I do that back to them. So, moment of truth, friends. Any of these perspectives in here that you recognize in yourself? Go, yeah, I've heard myself say that, or I've thought myself think that.
Yeah, definitely. How could they not know?
How could they not know,
I find
right?
myself saying that.
Absolutely. It's just their personality. I fall into that. Right. And I want to just say one thing, one thing about the how could they not know, right? That how could they not know has an embedded assumption in there that people were raised exactly like we were, right? And we know that there are so many differences, cultural differences, city, country of origin, how your family responded to conflict, what was rewarded and what wasn't rewarded for you when you were growing up in school, in your first job. All of those things really contribute, right? So how could they not know? And how come they don't do it the way I do it, assumes that somebody is a clone of us. Yeah. So I want to share with you what I believe for me has been the most helpful perspective, right? So we've got a bunch of unhelpful perspectives. Here's the most helpful perspective that I found, which is, it is highly likely that you are your difficult person's difficult person. So just take a moment to think about that. Ethan, I see you smiling. What do you think about that? The idea that if you experience somebody as difficult, chances are they experience you as difficult.
Yeah, I would say sure, because if they press your buttons, then chances are, they've got the reverse or the opposite buttons, and you're pressing theirs.
Yes, and I love where you pointed, because there's really two ways. I'm sure there's multiple ways in which we push buttons. That's what in-laws are for finding those multiple ways to push buttons. But sometimes we push each other's buttons, right? We're difficult for each other because we're so similar, right? We see a part of ourselves that we don't like in somebody else, right? So I might experience somebody as difficult because they're so pushy, and I'm a little pushy too, I have heard. And sometimes it may be because we are really different from each other. So I know more often than not, when my husband, Michael, experiences me as difficult, I know, first of all, that he's wrong. Just kidding. When he experiences me as difficult, it is likely because I am trying to hasten a decision, right? I'm trying to move us faster towards doing something. Now, my husband, Michael, is an engineer with an MBA. He is all about slow, methodical, calculated approach. So when I am being difficult for him because I'm driving us to make a fast decision, he's experiencing me as difficult, and I'm experiencing him as difficult, but because he's being so slow and methodical, right? So we are often triggered because somebody's like us, and we're often triggered and difficult because we're so different. And the first thing that I invite you to do is to think to yourself, if this person is driving me crazy, I should assume that I'm driving them crazy, and actually bring that to the table. And one thing that I will share with you, if any of you lead teams, whether it's in a volunteer capacity or in a professional capacity, I recommend that teams kick off with a "here's what's difficult about working with me" meeting. And here's what it sounds like, right? You get your team together for a new project or something like that, and to say some version of, we're all going to be working with each other. We have lots of different styles here. And I want to start by saying, here's what I know is difficult about working with me. So if it were me, for example, I might say, I am likely to focus less on the details and more on the outcomes. And I know for people who are slower and more methodical and measured in their approach, that can be frustrating when they actually want to understand my process rather than the outcome. Please give me that feedback. It's not the only thing that's difficult about working with me, but it's something that's been brought to my attention, and I'm really committed to working on that. And now, Pam, it's your turn. What is some feedback you've gotten about what's difficult about working with you? And by the way, you don't have to answer. It was just for illustration purposes, unless you'd like to.
I'm happy to answer.
Good. All right, Pam.
So what can be difficult working with me is that I tend to worry a lot. So I will point out all the things that could possibly get in our way and be roadblocks. And that can be challenging for people that just want to move forward and see what comes.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. And now we're going to go through every single person on this call. JK, we are not, but it is a great way to start a team meeting. And then everybody is open to feedback, hopefully giving feedback, receiving feedback, and it creates a little bit of shared vulnerability in the group. So with that being said, let's just talk a little bit about some things that most of us have in common, right? So some things that most of us want are to be treated with respect, to express our feelings, opinions, and wants, to advocate for our own priorities, to say no without feeling guilty. That is a big one for many of us, right? To be able to have opinions that are different from other people, to speak to people in positions of power without fear, to take care of and protect ourselves from feeling threatened in any way, and to create our own happy and healthy lives. So I want to just take a moment to put a little bit of this into action. So one of the things that I'm going to ask you to think about is, in your work life or in your volunteer life, what is something on this list where you go, that is not an issue for me? I get that I get that handled almost all of the time. So for me, it would be to be treated with respect. I don't work in organizations. I don't volunteer in organizations. I don't live in a family where I'm not treated with respect. That is something that I have almost always in my life. So I'm curious to know for you, which of these wants is something that you have almost always in your life? So I'm seeing number 8 from Pam. Great to create. You have the opportunity to create your own happy and healthy life. I see 4. Yep, to say no without feeling guilty. I see to take care of yourself. I see to be treated with respect. Excellent. All right, so here's the question I want to ask you. When this want or need is met, how are you likely to behave? So I will use myself as an example. When I recognize that I am treated with respect, I tend to show up as engaged and engaging. I tend to contribute a lot. Yeah, I'll stop there for a second. So when you have that particular need met, how do you show up? What does that look like on you?
More confident.
Yeah, great. So you show up as confident, right? What else? Ready to engage. I show up as contributing. What else? Hopefully I'm going to say optimistic, positive. Yep, I see motivated, validated, relaxed. Excellent. Okay, so now we're going to do the opposite. I want you to imagine, and maybe you don't have to imagine, maybe you really have an example of a situation that you might be in where one or more of these needs is getting bumped up against, having a little friction, doesn't feel like it's being honored as much as you'd like. I'd love to know what that one is for you. And I would say for me, well, most of these, are things that I have most often. Saying no without feeling guilty feels challenging for me sometimes. What would it be for you? Yeah, number 4. Number 4, especially with your daughter. Yeah, my daughter too. Something about daughters. To advocate for our own priorities, to have opinions that are different from others, 3 and 4. Okay, so with that in mind, I want you to contrast how you show up. So for me, when I feel like I can't say no, or I'm going to say no, but I feel guilty, I tend to withdraw. Right. And as you can imagine, I like to be engaged and engaging, but I do tend to withdraw. I might sometimes show up as sullen. What does it look like for you when that need doesn't get met? Not present? Yeah. What else? Resentful, checked out. Yeah. And so thank you for your self-awareness, and thank you for sharing that as well. Hesitant and withdrawn, quiet, disengaged. And I want you just to take a little scroll on that chat list. You know what I notice in that chat list? I notice that withdrawn, sullen, not present, resentful, checked out, disengaged, hesitant sounds an awful lot like somebody I would consider to be a difficult person. How about you? Right? But we've just described ourselves, right? What's happening, right? What really is happening is we need to recognize that when people's needs are not met, they act out. And sometimes acting out is withdrawing in. But if you have somebody that you live with or work with or volunteer with who seems to show up as disengaged or sullen or withdrawn or angry, it is highly likely that one of these needs here isn't getting met. And I invite you to ask them about it, to say, I notice that you seem upset. I notice that you seem angry. I notice you're not contributing as much as you're used to. What's going on, right? What's going on? I'd really like to understand what's happening from your perspective. And it is not enough for us just to ask them to open up the conversation so we can be empathetic to see if there's something that feels important to them that isn't being met. we also need to speak up for ourselves as well. And yet, we often have a lot of barriers that get in the way of us speaking up and advocating for ourselves. And these barriers live here, right? And one of the reasons that it's hard for us to speak up is based on this beautiful saying: we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are, right? We see the world not neutrally, but we see it through our own lenses, which means that our mindsets about advocating for what we want and need in order for us to be engaged and participatory, our mindsets will drive whether we do it or not. So here are some mindsets that tend to keep us quiet, right? And then I'd love to hear from you what you would add to this list, what you notice in yourself. I'm having a problem with somebody and I should just keep it to myself. Asking for what I need will be an uncomfortable conversation. I should put the team's needs ahead of my own personal needs. I don't have the time to advocate for what I want. And if I ask for what I want, I'm going to be seen as pushy, right? So for as long as these are our mindsets about speaking up, we won't speak up, because how we think drives how we feel, which drives what we do. Any of these mindsets seem familiar to you when you think about speaking up in a difficult situation, potentially difficult situation? And if so, please let me know in the chat box. And what would you add? Yeah, so I see here all of them resonate. Pushy and putting other people's needs first. Yeah. It's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. I don't have the energy for this. Yeah. So let me just share with you some mindsets. And my hope for you would be that at least one of these, I already know the answer will be no, that at least one of these mindsets feels like something you'd be willing to try on in the next week or so. Okay. So here are some mindsets that help us self-advocate. My needs are valid, at least as valid as anyone else's. If I don't start the conversation, who will? I'm curious about what could happen if I asked for what I needed, right? For all I know, it turns out it was an easy button, right? And I asked for what I needed and I got it. The most successful professionals model self-awareness, and that is what I'm doing by being aware of what I need and asking for it. And actually telling the truth is a brilliant way to create healthy relationships. So I'm going to poke you a little bit, and I'm going to ask you in the chat box to name a mindset that you would be willing to try on for the next week or two that would have you speak up rather than withdraw when something that feels important to you isn't being handled. What would you be willing to try? Telling the truth. I'm going to start the conversation. My needs are valid. I'm going to model this. Yeah, I love this, Adam. I have valuable insight that can help the team, right? And it sort of reminds me, you know, what I like about where you're pointing, Adam, is also, you know, as we think about, you know, our work as volunteers in the Jewish community, right? And you know, the federation system, for those of us who are solicitors, we often think about the idea of like, I'm not asking on behalf of myself, I'm asking on behalf of those who can't ask for themselves. So speaking up for your needs may be also asking on behalf of those who are not able or not willing to ask for what they need, but you are representing the group. Great. So I hope you will take this on as a little bit of homework, and just a little bit of language of what you might say, right? You might say, I'd like to talk about something that feels important to me. When would be a good time to talk about it? You might say, I need blank to feel engaged or respected or safe. And I have some ideas of what we could do differently. And you might say, I'm really happy in my role, right? To lower the anxiety of whoever you're talking to. And I recognize there's something that would help me feel even happier or more satisfied. So just a little bit of language that's all positive reframing. Okay, So we are now going to move on. We've talked about what contributes to conflict, understanding the root causes of common conflicts. And now we're going to talk about recognizing your personal conflict habits. So in about 2 minutes, you're going to have some time in a breakout room to have you reflect on what you learned about your personal conflict habits. So hopefully those of you who are here, and if you did not take the assessment that we sent ahead of time, do not run away. I promise we will make sure that there is an opportunity for you to participate in the conversation. But hopefully you had the opportunity to take the positive intelligence assessment by Shirzad Shamin, which talked a little bit about some of the saboteurs that we have, some of the ways in which we get in our own way. So just to let you know, I come up high in hypervigilant, right? I am all about scanning the environment for potential threats, which is exhausting and something that I am working on. And yet all of us learn this out of good reasons, and it's something that both protects us and can also get in our way in the face of conflict. So here is the conversation that I'm going to ask you to have in your breakout groups. And then I'm also going to give you a plan B if you're like, what assessment? I didn't see anything about it. So if you took the assessment in your group, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what are your top saboteurs, what felt surprising, and also what made total sense about this, like, oh yeah, it got me. And also, I didn't know that about me. What are the primary characteristics? How did you learn to think and act like this? And what can you be grateful for? How do your saboteurs show up in the face of conflict? And what is one thing you think you could do differently to keep your saboteur from derailing you? Okay, and you don't have to answer all of these questions. This is just a discussion guide. If you are thinking to yourself, I don't know what a saboteur is, I don't know what they're talking about, I should probably get off the call. No, don't get off the call. What I really like you to do is, number one, be a good listening partner to your folks in the group. And number two is I'd like you to talk about what habits do you notice show up for you in the face of conflict? What are they trying to get you? And what are they costing you? And what is something you think you could work on? Okay, that's the simple no assessment version of it. All right, so we're going to put you into some breakout groups. We're going to give you about 8 minutes in those breakout groups to have this conversation about what you're learning about yourself. And then we're going to bring you back here and we're going to tackle our last 2 topics. All right. I just like to. All right, we kicked him out, right?
Yeah.
All right.
We kicked him out.
You're good.
My favorite's to see like who pops
It all pop up. Yeah.
You know, it's a good breakout when they don't
come back.
Yeah. That's so true.
When they come back immediately, you're like, oh, what went wrong in that room?
I know. It's a little nauseating.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome back, friends. We are, Lindsay, Pam, and I are assuming that we are now all in a fight because we made you come back sooner than you wanted to. But we are having a disagreement and a difference of opinion or perspective. And my perspective is we're going to end on time, which means we needed to pull you back. Mostly because I'm hungry, right? I could stay on this all day, but like it's lunch and I'm hungry. So before we move to our last 2 chunks, any aha about yourself that you'd like to share? Please do not share an aha for somebody else because that is an oy vey. Any aha about yourself?
I found this to be one of the most spot on personal assessments that I've taken in a very long time.
And it was free. I mean, that, right? Isn't that amazing? What really resonated for you?
One, the fact that it was 50 questions. Let's start there.
Okay.
And then my top 3, hypervigilant, hyperachiever, and controller. And then I go to my bottom 3, restless, avoider, and victim.
Yeah.
I know, I'm not obviously at liberty to share right now, but I know exactly what has formed these answers. I know exactly what has gone on in my past that's led to the answers that are on the screen right now.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I hope you'll read the book because the book is really helpful. And for those of you who, lead teams, this is an activity that I do an awful lot of team building around, having people sort of take this assessment, and just the process of sharing around yourself. I tend to show up like this, and here's why, and here's what I'd like to work on. That can already really open up a conversation. So thank you for taking the opportunity to reflect on yourself. And of course, I will make sure that if anybody has any questions, I will make sure that I'm available to answer those afterwards. So let's talk about our last two building blocks. I want to talk about, how we sometimes respond to conflict. And one of the ways in which we sometimes respond to conflict is by avoiding it. And I think about conflict avoiding a little bit like sugar in salad dressing, which is, it is so sneaky, right? There should not be sugar in salad dressing. And then you look at your sugar intake, you're like, what? That was from ranch. That is BS. And so sometimes the ways in which we avoid isn't, I'm not talking about it. It's super sneaky that we're not even aware of it. So some examples of ways in which we avoid are inattention, right? So inattention can look like, oh, Adam's mad at me. I didn't know, I wasn't really paying attention. All right, I guess he is, right? Inattention. Too busy or delay. So too busy is like, well, look, if Jeffrey's got a problem with me, I got 1,000 other things that I'm working on that are more important right now. Jeffrey's going to have to wait. Or, I hear that Gary is upset, and you know what? I bet if I just give Gary some time, it'll blow over. Okay, I'm sure it'll just blow over. That's too busy or delay. Actively ignore or deny is, Andrew's upset? Huh, nope, I don't think so. I think he's fine, right? Nope, there's no problem there. Other ways in which we sometimes respond to conflict is, well, look, I know that Maria is frustrated with me, but Maria could bring it up with her manager. Like, it's not my job to deal with Maria about that. That's her manager's job to talk to Maria about that. A super sneaky one is confusion. And this is when we say to ourselves, I don't get why, when what we mean is, I don't like it that. Okay. And I promise you, now that you've heard this, you are going to see it all over the place. So you say like, well, I don't get why he doesn't call me back after I've left a message. Your question isn't, I don't get why, it's, I'm pissed. I don't like it that, right? And so it's so much more socially acceptable to say, I don't understand why, when what we mean is, I do not like it. And then finally, my favorite sneaky sauce when it comes to avoiding conflict is confirmation expedition. So here's what it looks like. Hey, David, Lindsay? Like, I don't know about you, but I cannot get Lindsay to return an email in 3 days, right? It's not me, it's Lindsay, right? Okay, great. Thanks, David. That was super helpful. Hey, Andrea, Lindsay? Right? Right? I can't get Lindsay to return a call. Okay, good. I'm glad it's not me. I'm glad it's Lindsay. Hey, Joshua, Lindsay? That is what is known as a confirmation expedition, where you are going to everybody other than the person that you have a problem with to confirm what? That you are right and they are a beast. And it is one of the most toxic ways in which we work in organizations. It happens in volunteer life. It happens in professional life. And I want to tell you two things. And I'm coming down hard on you because I believe you can take it. Number one is stop doing this. And if you need to confirm with somebody that they work well with. Right. So if I know that, I'm having trouble with Lindsay, but I know that she and Amy are tight, I'm going to go to Amy and say, Amy, I cannot get Lindsay to return an email. And I know that you and Lindsay work brilliantly together. Could you give me some advice on how I can, get a response from Lindsay? You're probably doing something right that I'm not doing right, and I want to learn. And if somebody comes to visit you on a confirmation expedition, your goal is not to be like, oh yeah, and then what else did she do? Your goal is to say, how can we make this conversation productive? How can I help you brainstorm solutions, as opposed to being the center of Lashon Hara, the center of gossip? Okay, so I really want you to avoid this where it happens, so that you can really bring it up. And I just want to share with you a little bit of language, which is, if you're going to bring up something you've been avoid bringing up, you could say, I've been avoid mentioning blank until now because I blank. I'm bringing it up now because I blank and I should have brought it up sooner. So here's what this Mad Lib could look like and what you shouldn't do with this Mad Lib. So this Mad Lib could look like, I've been avoiding mentioning the fact that you have canceled our last 3 supervision meetings until now, because I know how busy you are. I'm bringing it up now because I'm actually not clear on what our priorities are without those supervision meetings, and I realized I should have brought it up sooner. That is much more effective than, I've been avoiding mentioning you canceling our supervision meetings because I know how defensive you get when anybody brings anything up to you. You understand how that's different? How that may not get you the outcome you're looking for? I mean, it'll get you an outcome. It's probably not going to get you the outcome you're looking for. And so what I want to just do in our last couple of minutes is our last strategy, which is how to snap out of an unproductive conversation. Stop the conversation. Notice and name neutrally what's going on, what you see. Ask them what they're experiencing and propose a process for moving forward. So here's what it could look like. Stop the conversation. Hey, Adam, let's pause for a moment. Let's just take a quick timeout. I noticed that we've got tight deadlines and we are not turning it around in time. I also noticed that it's making me feel ineffective. And I'm not the only one involved here. So Adam, what are you noticing? How do you feel? How do you see it? And then, Adam, here's what I think we should do next so that we're not spinning. Or Adam, I have no idea what we should do next. What do you think we should do so that we're not spinning? And that is a quick way to snap out of an unproductive conflict. So we covered an awful lot. I, of course, want 5 more hours, which we do not have. So I'm going to, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat box, here's how you can find me on LinkedIn, because I'm constantly writing. I write for Harvard Business Review. I write for Inc., Psychology Today. If you want to see what I'm writing about these sorts of topics, please come follow me on LinkedIn. And you're also welcome to email me if you'd like to talk more about this. But I want to hear from you, what is one concrete skill or approach that you are taking away from today that made this last hour of us collectively not eating lunch worth your time?
I would say for me, it's starting meetings with or otherwise introductions to people as to my, I don't even want to say flaws, but observations, so that it can form an initial connection.
Great. And you can even say it, Adam, as, you know, previous feedback that I've gotten is this. And so this is something that I'm working on. Yeah. Thanks, Adam. I really like the sentence at the end, I've been avoiding. I see productive conflict. Randy just gave us a, it all worked. Validating others' opinions with valid. Recognizing my saboteurs. Excellent. My request for all of you is, please do not keep what we talked about today to yourself. If there is a skill in here, a mindset in here that would be helpful for you to share with a colleague, a boss, a fellow volunteer, a kid, a partner, anybody who you think could use a little bit of some strategies around navigating conversations. We have done in an hour what often takes, you know, a half a day or a full day to get through. So thank you for welcoming my New York City speed. And Lindsay, let me turn it over to you just to close us up.
Thanks, Deb. I'm actually going to hand it off to Jeff, who just finished concluding the his chairmanship of MLI to close us out.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I think that's really relevant to all of us that are leaders in the community. Leveraging our mindsets to amplify the work being done in this community and in our role as Jewish leaders is crucial to planning for our future. We are responsible for building a stronger Jewish community. As leaders, we stand stronger when we stand together. If any of you or your organization needs resources, such as leadership and professional development workshops, trainings, or leadership succession planning, please do not hesitate to reach out to the Mandel Center. Information will be made available to you in the chat feature. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sam.